Hello, guys. Welcome to our 8th annual Oscar Salon. If you're anything like me, you had no idea what an Oscar Salon was, but you heard the name Oscar and you were interested. So let me give you a little bit of history of what a salon is. So in the 14th, 15th century, the lord of the manor would have this party and these hosted discussions where he would invite these brilliant minds to talk about politics, religion, art, and they would have these discussions around these themes. And so we call this an Oscar Salon because it's exactly that. We're going to have some great conversations tonight with some brilliant minds all about the themes that we see in these nominated films and how they intersect with culture. So if you're wondering how this all got started, or maybe you've heard of Brian Coley, the movie whisperer, and you're not sure what his process is, we think this next video is going to explain really clearly.
Just outside Atlanta, Georgia, there's a guy some people call the movie whisperer. His name is Brian Coley, and he has the innate ability to understand and interpret people through their favorite movies. An NYU film grad and a former editor at Turner Broadcasting, today Coley runs a company called Reel, where he movie whispers on a small scale by showing people what their top 10 favorite movies say about their personal story. But his biggest revelation came 8 years ago when he started looking at the yearly slate of Best Picture nominees at the Academy Awards to see whether there were any common themes shared between the films.
Because I believe that the Oscars are prophetic and that our artists are our prophets to our generation.
The Oscar nominees give us a picture of where our narrative is headed.
How the Oscars have been kind of foreshadowing our story as a country.
So if you look at what we do at Real Experiences, where we take a person's top 10 movies, and it forms this palette that we can look at certain threads and themes, and ultimately it brings out insights for a person's story. But I thought, why not try that with the Oscar films, like the nominees? They form a palette of films. And what I found is as soon as I started looking for threads and themes and insights, it was just like they were pouring out. And then what was crazy is that those insights and themes actually played out in culture over the course of the next year.
In other words, Brian Coley believes that the annual Oscar nominees actually foreshadow major cultural events in America before they happen.
All right, and we're back with Brian Coley himself, the movie whisperer.
Did you tell everybody who you are?
I didn't. Hi, I am Mariah Cruz, and I am your host for this evening.
Yes, a wonderful host. You look great, by the way.
Thank you.
Don't we
We
look
look
dazzling?
good together, guys, don't we? We're feeling pretty festive for the Oscars. So, Brian, I am so excited to hear all of your thoughts. From that video, though, still seems a little mystical, kind of like magical what you do. Tell me exactly movie whispering. What is it and what isn't it?
Yeah, so I would say the thing that is not is I'm not trying to fortune tell or read the tea leaves. Instead, I just believe that every year we get this unique opportunity. And I know a lot of people think the Oscars are just irrelevant and they're just a lot of people don't even pay attention, right? Mm-hmm. But think about it. Every year we have the best and brightest artists of our time, mm-hmm. and we're bringing together these works. They're the best works of our time, right? And nobody is looking at the meaning behind the movies, right?
Right.
So we just look at the movies and we look at the party and we look at the dresses and all this kind of stuff, but we don't look at the meaning.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, what if we brought together these films and said, what's the meaning that these films share? What are the themes? And that's how it all kind of started, was looking at the themes and the Oscar nominees for Best Picture.
I love that. And so you've been doing this for 8 years.
Right.
So you've had lots of film and culture connections. Can you give us an example of one?
Well, that's a great point, though. The thing that's really interesting is I've seen this play out in culture. Mm-hmm. Like I've seen it foreshadow and almost play out, or not almost, it's played out in culture. So
yeah.
The best example I can give is back in 2020, when the pandemic was just a blip on our radar. In February of 2020 was the Oscar ceremony.
Okay.
So you got all these Oscar nominated pictures, and they've been made way previous to this. And they all come together. And when I looked at these films, what I saw was there was this theme of testing our devotion to see if we would be our brother and sister's keeper.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And so 2 months later, what would we do?
There was a little pandemic that we had.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we were testing our devotion to each other, whether it was mask, whether it was, the call for racial justice in the summer to be our brother and sister's keeper, as far as our brothers and sisters of color, and then testing our devotion as far as the election, right? So
Oh, wow.
all of this was playing out after the Oscars, kind of looking at the Oscar themes in 2020. And that's just one example. I can give you like every single year and show you how it's played out.
I would love that. That would be a good video. So I'm super curious, what was last year's theme and how did it play out?
Right. So let's look at last year. Usually these are the nominees for last year. And then usually I do this thing that you're going to see next, which is these bubbles. So what I do is I take all the themes that I start as I'm watching the movies, I start seeing these themes starting to emerge. And then you see in the parentheses, that's how many movies that have this theme in them. So the biggest one, which is in the middle, you can see is dignity and self-respect. So that was the big theme last year. And then you see ownership as a bigger theme, or kind of a smaller theme.
Okay.
Loss is a smaller theme. You see protest up there. So a lot of themes around dignity and loss and ownership. So it forms what I usually do each year is like a dramatic question, right? So this was the dramatic question for last year. It is, can we reclaim a sense of dignity after suffering loss? Wow. So that's what we were asking last year with the Oscars. Can we reclaim a sense of dignity after suffering loss? And a lot of the answers to that was like ownership and interdependence and independence and interdependence and ownership and really the small and big acts of protest.
Yeah.
So that's what was last year.
Can we regain a sense of dignity after loss?
Yeah.
Super curious to see how that played out last year in the history. And so I know you sat down with a historian. You sat down with Steve Heimler. He is a history teacher. He runs an excellent YouTube channel called Heimler History. Over 300,000 subscribers. We'll link him in the bio below so you can go check out and just brush up on your history lessons. And so like what better person to talk about history and how that theme has played out than talking to historians. So how was that interview?
Oh, it was so good. So it started like this. I asked Steve, I said, Steve, what are you working on? Like, what are you passionate about? He said, humiliation in European history. And I went, don't know how that's going to work, right?
A little different.
But think about it. What is the opposite side of dignity? It is humiliation. And as soon as we started talking from that standpoint, it was just like tons of bricks falling, the lights are, lighting up. I talked to him, I said, tell me, let's go back in history and look at a moment where there was this connection between humiliation and recapturing a sense of dignity after loss. And he took me to World War I, right after World War I.
Okay, all the way back.
And this is what he said. So here's the clip.
Yeah, as soon as you said that, I immediately go to the peace settlement after World War I. Germany was essentially blamed for the entire war. It's not true. There was a whole host of factors that led to this war. But Britain and France, they both, their nations and their populations were devastated. And so when they came to the peace table, their whole goal was to make Germany pay, both in dignity and in actual remuneration. And so what they did in the peace treaty was they added not only a provision for reparations that Germany had to pay for all the damage that was caused in the war, but also they added something that was essentially completely unnecessary. It was the war guilt clause, which said right there in the peace treaty, the entire responsibility for this war, all the death and destruction it caused, is borne by Germany alone.
Yeah.
Wow. So you have Germany that's lost this war, and then now they just pile on humiliation on top of that.
Right. And so then I was asking him, so how does recapturing dignity, come after that?
Yeah.
And it was World War II, and this is how he explains it.
In the post-war years, Germany fell into a deep economic depression. They experienced hyperinflation, where at the height of it, it was the exchange rate between dollars and marks was like 1 to 4.2 million. Marks were so worthless, people would put them in blocks and give them their kids to play with and wallpaper with them, and so they were economically ruined. And that was essentially Britain and France's goal. The French premier said, I want to reduce Germany to a potato patch. And so strip away their industrial capacity, strip away their military, all of that. and humiliate them on the world stage so that this would never happen again. But it actually caused it to happen again, because in the midst of all of that suffering, people are starving. It's economic chaos in Germany, and so people began looking for a strong man to make things right. And that's when you get the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, who, by the way, a lot of people don't seem to know this, came to power not in tanks driving down the boulevard, but by voting. He came into power through legitimate means, because people wanted somebody to solve their problems. And so the first thing Hitler did, cancel the reparations. We're not paying for any of this anymore. Remilitarize places like the Rhineland and reclaim places in Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, places that had been taken from them. And essentially, he wanted to restore German greatness because they had been humiliated on the world stage.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So you have this strong man emerging in Hitler,
Yeah.
and then he's trying to recapture dignity for Germany by ownership of land.
Right, exactly. Does that sound familiar at all?
Just a little familiar. Yeah.
So here we are, in this moment that we're in right now, and here is this theme playing out.
Right.
This idea of loss, recapturing dignity in regard to Russia, right? And
Right,
so I
yeah.
asked Steve, I said, tell me a little bit about Russia and about Putin, because it seems like the narrative that's coming out is this whole idea of him trying to make the Soviet Union great again. And so this is what he said.
Well, you have to understand that during the Cold War, there were two great powers in the world, and neither of them were really coming out on top, the United States and the Soviet Union. But in 1991, under the policies of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union falls, and now they are humiliated on the world stage. And during that time, a guy named Vladimir Putin was a KGB agent. And he thought Mikhail Gorbachev was the worst, because Gorbachev essentially brought in some pro-Western policies to try to reduce the oppression and the totalitarian policies of the past. And that ultimately led to the downfall. You can't have a society like that without a strong iron fist. And so as Putin rises to power, he actually says this in the 90s. He says that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, which, in light of everything we just talked about, is an astonishing statement. Like, we've had 2 world wars, endless destruction, loss of human life. And it was the fall of the Soviet Union, in his mind, that was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And so during his presidency, he has attempted through various interventions, we saw in Crimea and Chechnya, all these places, to reassemble the greatness of the former Soviet Union, but now, of course, Russia. And so, very much to Vladimir Putin, this is a game of correcting the humiliation that occurred to his people, to his nation, in the eyes of the world.
Wow, man, that's so fascinating to me, because while there's absolutely no justification of countless lives being lost in Ukraine, it's interesting from a literary point of view, because every villain has like an origin story.
Right.
And so in Putin, he sees the Soviet Union collapsing as this huge loss.
Mm-hmm.
He feels humiliation.
Right.
He tries to recapture dignity by ownership of land. And then the ownership of land is Ukraine. And we're watching that play out.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And again, we don't want to be tone deaf to the fact that this is, huge. But at the same time, what's uncomfortable about this is it's almost like we're humanizing Hitler. And
right.
Putin.
It is a little uncomfortable.
It is very uncomfortable. Right. And so, but I think about it from when we used to work with screenwriters. One of the things I would tell screenwriters is I would say, listen, in order to create a dimensional villain, you have to understand their motives. And so I think that concept of understanding people's motives is so huge, even if they're madmen. Right?
Yeah.
And
so you have global history. We have just kind of history. I'm curious of how this theme played out, like in America currently.
Yeah, well, it played out earlier that year in 2020, last year. It played out in January 6th, right?
So right on the heels.
But so I asked Steve, I said, Tell me a little bit about how this, like January 6th, was related to this theme. And he took me back all the way to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And this is what he said.
I mean, the whole reason Donald Trump was elected to begin with is because he was able to tap into a very strong nationalist sentiment in two groups of people. You had essentially working class folks in the Rust Belt who have for decades had their jobs removed from them and shipped overseas, and essentially there's no one left to fight for them. Their economic status has been flattened out. They have a deep resentment against what they would consider the liberal elite who look down their noses at them and their conservative beliefs. And then you've got especially a big swath of evangelical Christians who feel like, especially since the late 60s and early 70s, that their cultural power has been taken away from them. And so that was the theme of his presidency, taking back what has been lost and restoring it. That was his whole campaign, right? Make America great again. Like I want to restore what has been lost.
Yeah, and so then you look at the election in 2020, right? And you have people who finally feel like maybe they have dignity, if you're putting yourself in the shoes of Trump supporters, and then they lose. So you lose the election. And then what happens next is, well, I've got to recapture dignity again, right? And even if it means, twisting a little bit of the narrative or whatever. Yeah. And so I was curious with Steve. I was like, tell me, was there ever an exit ramp, for Trump as far as, just this idea of maintaining dignity in some way during the process? And this is what he said.
It was actually Trump himself who cut himself off from the exit ramp. He cut himself off and all of his followers who loved him so dearly from any possibility of avoiding humiliation, because his claim was that the only possible way that I will lose is if the election is stolen and the election is illegal. And so there was no possible way for him to avoid to have a graceful exit. And so I think that's what you saw on January 6th is the result of all that pent up humiliation and all that pent up angst and rage that really had been building up for decades. And the proposition of losing what had been gained, of having somebody who is front and center in American politics, who knows us and fights for us and takes care of our interests, if that goes away, then everything we have is lost.
Yeah, and so us being the Trump supporters, right?
Yeah. So it's the same recipe. It's these people had a leader that gave them dignity, and then he loses the election. You have to kind of come up with some type of narrative to explain that kind of loss, and you feel humiliated in front of the world stage, and then you try to regain a sense of dignity back by a capital insurrection. And it's the thing that you're taking ownership of is the electoral process.
Yeah, the actual electoral ballot, right?
Right.
They're trying to take ownership of that. So yeah, so that's kind of the way that theme played out in 2021.
That's amazing.
As well as, taking us back and looking at it through history too. Yeah.
That's wild to me. So I love this idea of history and all these kind of things, but is there a way that he could have had his dignity preserved?
Well, I think what Steve said was that, just the natural course of in the election, usually there's dignity in just passing the torch, whenever a president gives a concession speech, that kind of thing is the natural course. That's what he said. But anyway, that's 2021. Yeah. So that's kind of the theme.
You already had so many things just all in that one year. So now I have to know, what does this year have to say?
I'm excited to tell about this year. So this year's Oscars, right? So this is the themes we're going to be looking at tonight. These are the nominees. So what you see at the bottom of the screen is the nominees for Best Picture this year. Wow. All 10 of them. So this is the first year that they have allowed 10 movies to be Oscar nominees. And so it's almost like what we do at Reel. We look at people's top 10 movies, right? Yeah.
America's top 10 movies.
Or at least, the artistic top 10 movies. Probably America would have a little bit of say so differently. But anyway, these are the top 10 movies. And so we're looking at what are the themes. And so here comes my bubbles again. So here are the bubbles. And what you see here is the big bubbles again are the bigger themes, and the smaller bubbles are the minor themes. I want to take you to the first one to examine tonight, which I'm really excited about this theme from the standpoint of, how relevant it is, almost how prophetic it is again. And that is the little gray one. It has 5 movies. So 5 movies share this theme. And the theme is processing culpability and / owning the whole story.
Processing culpability. So what does processing culpability look like in the films?
I'm glad you asked. So this is always hard for me because I'm trying to tell people about movies in a way that, maybe they've not seen these movies. So I'm going to do my best. But I would say that Drive My Car is probably the movie you should see when it comes to this theme. And that's because in this movie, you have characters who are dealing with who is culpable, processing that culpability and owning the whole story. And it happens with a main character, a guy, and he has a driver, this girl who's the driver of him, taking him back and forth in the car. And as they're processing each other's stories, they say, well, I killed my loved one. And then she says, I killed my loved one. And they didn't directly kill them. So that's really important to note. They did not directly kill them, but they feel culpable and they have to process that culpability of their inaction and their not ability to confront. And then what you're seeing right here is West Side Story, right? West Side Story is like, you killed him, And so there's a lot of processing culpability. In fact, the ending, Maria's going, you killed and you killed and you killed. And she's trying to, say that, this whole warring factions that you had is the whole story within that. And then we move on with the images you're seeing right now is Nightmare Alley. It's hard because I don't want to give spoiler alerts, but there is a death that happens in this, and there is someone who is culpable for that death. And the whole movie, he's processing his culpability, and actually he's not really processing it. He's trying to sweep it underneath the rug and really not avoid the entire story. And then finally, what you see in Don't Look Up, which is one of the movies that you have this young graduate student who finds this comet that's coming hurling towards Earth and is going to result in our annihilation. And so she's found this big discovery. And what happens? Well, it's just like, we want to sweep it underneath the rug. We don't want to deal with it right now. And so it's that, no processing and no embracing the whole story. So those are the 5 films.
Honestly, you sound pretty passionate though about culpability, and I know that you had a conversation with a friend of yours, Adam Thomason, who is a writer and a director and a producer at 3 Strim Films, and you guys have had a little bit of history around this conversation about processing culpability.
Well, and it's more than even processing culpability. Really, it started with us having a conversation at a conference over a table, and Adam was basically presenting from a race perspective. He was presenting a lot of historical, education on it. And it just blew my mind because these were the thoughts and process and the things he was telling me were things that I never learned in my history books. Like, for example, one of the ones that just blew my mind was just manifest destiny, as a person of faith, he tells me that it's the Pope over here saying, you have my blessing to go colonize the world and take from people their land and stuff like that. Like the Pope blesses us, right? And then just different aspects of history that led me to kind of educate myself in the past and looking at our past as a country. And I know that's really a hot topic and really a touchy topic right now. But I feel like that idea of going back to the past, looking at our sins of the past, and kind of having a sense of ownership is so important. And so Adam has been so critical with that, critical for me in processing that idea of culpability, right? And so I asked Adam, I said, is there, there's a lot of feeling when people, they get really anxious because, I don't own slaves and I wasn't, I'm not a racist, even if the generation before me were racist. So there's that sort of sense in which, it's not me, and I can't own this. And so what Adam presented was Germany again. So we're back at Germany.
I love this history lesson.
Yep. And Adam showed me in how Germany handled processing their culpability and owning their whole story after World War II. So here's what he says.
Germany didn't swallow the pill that Americans swallowed, and we swallowed the pill of humanism in the Renaissance strongly. And what humanism in the Renaissance tells you is that you are responsible for what you do in the here and the now, and there's nothing in the past that truly ties you to the present. It's kind of it's kind of a delusion of, you know, I got here all by myself, right? And whether as Germany, if we're talking about the concentration camps and things of that nature, you know, you got statues, you got celebration holidays, things like that, where they didn't swallow the pill of humanism. It was a we did this, and since we are the descendants of the people who did this, then it's on us to reconcile these things of the past. And that's why you saw them, you know, take down certain statues. You saw them give stipends to the descendants of a lot of these Jews that were in the concentration camps. And I believe in America, that's why you've seen that resistance, specifically when it comes to slavery. You've seen America try to hand out stipends when it comes to Japanese in the concentration camps, and do what they can when it comes to natives. And natives will even tell you that's not enough. But as a whole, I would say America and the generations of now, who are European descendants, they don't see their culpability, because in their mindset, humanistically, they weren't directly responsible for that. So if we're going to jump from the trampoline of humanism, then from your rationale, I can understand why you draw that conclusion.
Yeah, that's good, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of humanism stopping people from processing culpability is an interesting thought. And so Adam also had a really great point of how to process this inherited culpability.
Yeah, he gives an illustration that's from the Bible. So just to context, that's what he's taking it from, is scripture. And he's looking at this illustration of how to connect the past to the present. So this is what
the scriptures are written through a Jewish cultural perspective. And why that matters is there's certain illustrations that are used that are very important. And one of the illustrations that are used is leaven when it comes to bread. And if you know about leaven or yeast in bread, what does it do? It spreads. And so when people don't understand the ramifications of that illustration, then you won't understand the ramifications of your place in human history to do something about the leaven that spread from the past, right? Right. You see what I'm saying? So if we're talking about what is my place in this timeline, whether you see a linear or circular, what is my place in this timeline in light of the leaven in human history that has spread and caused its effects? And so what I would say is the yeast of slavery created a leaven that spread when it comes to opportunities, when it comes to human value, when it comes to the legacy of equity, when it comes to the legacy of inclusion, when we're talking about diversity. And I'm talking about diversity on funds, who has access to funds, who are the millionaires, who are the billionaires, who runs these universities. So even as, you know, we're talking about a hot topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, we're here on this timeline, and let's just say this timeline is the bread that is, you know, full maturation, right? It has risen. Well, there was yeast put in the dough called America, and no one's asking, okay, what was that yeast? Now this thing has risen. How can we do something about that? It's, well, I didn't put the yeast in there. And I go, yeah, you may not have put the yeast in there, but you're going to knead that dough out. You're going to spread it. You're going to put toppings on there. You're going to eat the pizza and enjoy the fruits, you know, and you can't have one without the other. But I understand in that humanistic mindset, you go, well, I ain't put it in there. Yeah, but you're eating from it though. And some are starving from it. And that is antithetical to the gospel. And I would tell people, you cannot have a freedom in the present of your imperfections and your faults without looking to the past of what Christ's work did. His work was accomplished in the past, and you benefit from it in the present.
Wow.
Man, that's just so
deep.
Something about that, not the leaven in the bread, like would have never put that together. And you're eating the pizza, and again, this feels very relevant for here and now. This idea of people not wanting to own the story, not processing culpability, not even wanting to like talk about the narrative. You know?
Right. And I asked Adam about that. You know, I know. And this is a hot topic, right? It's even hard to bring up as far as this is concerned, but it's so relevant, right? Like people are making laws to try to keep us from looking at the past, right?
Right. Yeah.
And and so there's a lot of confusion around critical race theory, and I asked Adam about that and whether he could kind of bring some light to that, especially with this analogy of leaven and bread. So
honoring the story of any people group is honoring their humanity. And when you edit out the story of that people group, you're editing out their humanity. And I don't think people see that clearly. And here's one thing I do want to say about CRT. There's a lot of bad things going around about CRT, specifically that as a whole, people of color believe that white folks are inherently evil or support these systems. There's a lot of that stuff going around with CRT, and that's just not the truth. CRT in its simple form is essentially saying that there was leaven put in the dough of America called preferential systems, and those systems were preferred toward people of European descent. And fast forward, those systems of preference still benefit people of European descent more than other people groups. That is the base thing. And they're saying if you go around naively thinking like it's all equal and there was no starting point for there to be a benefit for one people group over another people groups, plural, then there's a naivety, and we actually won't achieve the reconciliation, diversity, equity, inclusion, and unity that we seek for. So it has nothing to do with the inherent evil of a people group. I just wanted to make that clarifying point because there's a lot of bad stuff going around.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, he brings up a lot of points of the negatives of not owning the narrative and what happens.
Sweeping it underneath the rug.
Yeah, like what are the dangers?
Editing the story, right?
Not even letting people the ability to have that story be the true narrative. But what I love about Adam is that he also provides a lot of like hope and this idea of what could we have, what could we achieve if we embrace the total narrative.
Me too. Yeah.
So let's see this clip here.
Yeah, my hope is one that is aspirational. You know, I always tell people how cool it is if we could do something that our ancestors couldn't because we were willing to embrace a truth that our ancestors weren't willing to embrace. And so a lot of people actually think that pain is the tough thing. Nope, if you look at the cross, though the pain was tough, there was a hope that Christ believed that was coming. And I think a lot of people are so blinded by the pain that they cease to have that hope that's on the other side of it. So I would actually argue for the other flip side of the coin and say, when you embrace the true narrative and the darkness and the pain of what it is, you actually then have true hope and true peace and true shalom on the other end. And again, how cool would it be if we embrace something that our ancestors didn't because they didn't want to deal with the pain of the truth that was? We will see something that you will never see, that you've never saw in the history books. And so that's why I live, that's why I talk, is because I do believe that that's something that we've never seen can happen, but it has to be time to dealing with that and embracing that true narrative, that true pain.
That's so good, right?
Man, I feel like I just went to church again.
Yeah.
That was good. That was very deep, though, and that was just a minor theme. There's more themes.
One theme, which is this idea of process. And I want to say one thing. I think, the word culpability can be like triggering for people or whatever, but it's processing culpability. The ability to have these discussions like we're doing right now. Right? That's processing culpability. Like in the movies, they didn't kill their loved ones, but they were processing that culpability.
And that's an easier entry point to these hard conversations.
And they're confronting, and they're not sweeping under things underneath the rug. I just think that's what I love about this.
Yeah.
So that's a minor theme. And then, so let's look at some of the major themes this year. So I'll go right to the big one, which is right in the middle. It's the blue one. It's called territorialism is what I call it. Or another way I say it is this land is my land. So what you have in these movies, and you see it's 10 movies, all 10 movies have this theme in it. So it's pretty big. So what you see in these movies is these characters who are marking their territory. They're like drawing the line and marking their territory.
So 10 movies have territorialism. Yeah. What does that look like in the films?
Yeah, so I'll take 4 films that I feel like are just like blatant, this land is my land. The first one is Power of the Dog. So Power of the Dog has Benedict Cumberbatch plays this main character who is constantly throughout the whole film, he is like marking his territory. And he's a how do you say it? Machismo. You know, he's like this bravado of a man, right? You know, like I'm a cowboy and you know. And so, but he's marking his territory throughout the whole film by engaging in this psychological warfare with his sister-in-law, who's new to this farm that they live on. And so he's like saying, no, this land is my land. And then if you go to, let's see, West Side Story, like West Side Story is like classic, right? It's two gangs and they're fighting over this land. This land is my land. So it's two gangs, the Jets and the Shark, and the whole movie is them, you know, having this kind of, you know, I want to, you know, preserve this land as my land, you know, and marking their territory, right? And then you go to Dune. Oh my gosh, Dune.
I love Dune.
Right? And so Dune, let's think about Dune, right? And its timing specifically. So it's this planet, that's this territory, and all of these, you know, they've decided to mark this territory as their own. So the Harkonnens, Arrakis is the territory. I'm sounding like nerd. I'm nerding out here. So Arrakis is the planet, and these Harkonnens are the ones who are invading this planet and just deciding they're going to mine its resources, and they ignore the native people, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so they just come in and take over and say, this land is my land, you know, mark it as their territory. And then finally you have Belfast, and then Belfast, it is the literal story, you know, like if you go back and like, this is a true story of, you know, a neighborhood where this family lives, and it's during the time in which Protestants and Catholics are marking their territory and they're warring against each other. And so this is a story about one neighborhood that actually is caught in the middle of this territorialism where people are marking their territory.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see it in all four of the movies, especially with Dune.
And it's in all of the films, if you can believe it.
Yeah. Something about that, though, again, has that familiar feel to it. Like what we're seeing in Russia and what we're seeing in Ukraine and this marking territory. Like you see it so clearly, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, is what we see it so clearly, right? And so I just think this is absolutely supernatural when you think of these movies coming together. And to me, it hit me one day that this is a picture of empathy, right? Oh, wow. So these movies are timed so much so that we can get a picture of empathy for the Ukrainian people. So Power of the Dog is like, I mean, you know, the picture of Putin, you know, on his horse. I mean, he's literally, there's a picture of Putin shirtless on his horse with this bravado, machismo, you know, and then, you know, and then he's entering the Ukraine and he's marking his territory. He's marking the Ukraine as his territory, as his own, right? And, you know, drawing the line and saying, this land is my land. And then I see within West Side Story, just the idea of, you know, two factions and trying to cross those barriers. And then Dune is, I mean, watch Dune and you're really watching the war in Ukraine. You're really watching. In fact, my wife and I were watching Dune last night, literally. And all of a sudden she stops it because we have the subtitles on, because we have to have the subtitles on. And she goes, did I just see that? And the bad guy, the Baron.
Okay.
Guess what his first name is?
No, it's not.
It is.
No, it's Vladimir.
Can you believe that?
What are the odds of that?
So here, the bad guy is Vladimir in the movie, the one who's actually taking over the land.
That's crazy.
It's amazing. And then Belfast, I would encourage you to watch Belfast because it gives you a picture of what it is like to be a Ukrainian person who's caught in the middle of a war zone and who has to figure out, am I going to stay or am I going to go? I mean, that's that movie. Can you imagine like that timing of that movie happened right now is just absolutely amazing to me. So
man, those are
I'm a little bit passionate.
just a little bit, you know, but I love it because these themes, while they are heavy, they are very important and they are timely and they give us a sense of, like you said, empathy. And so empathy kind of leads me to my next question. What did you find as far as themes of hope? Like, I need some hope. What does the films have to say for this year?
Yeah, and so this is one of those things where I don't want to appear prescriptive or I don't want to appear, you know, like Pollyanna optimistic or something like that. But there is something in these movies that just gave me hope in a huge way. Like,
I'm excited.
There is I don't know if I want to say solution, but it just feels like there might be a solution. And so if we go back to the bubbles, you'll see that the second biggest one is Gen Z as change agents. So this is historic. Let me say that to the camera. This is historic. Like never in Oscar history that I know of have 9 out of the 10 Oscar. So the majority of the Oscar films has as the main character, guess what?
They're young.
They're young.
They're
right?
young.
They're specifically Gen Z, right?
Wow.
So all of these characters are Gen Z characters, and all of them are change agents in their world.
What's that got to mean? So what does that look like in all of the films? Because you have
so let me give you the list. So here's the list. So you start off with the little boy who's 9 years old in Belfast.
Okay.
All right. And then you quickly move to a teenage girl who's the lead in Coda. And then you go to Timothy Chalamet, who plays the lead in Dune. He's the teenage boy in Licorice Pizza, and a 20-something girl in Licorice Pizza. And then Venus and Serena Williams, they're teenage girls. So we tell this story as them as teenage girls. And then we got a whole lot of teenagers in West Side Story, right? And then you kind of move up the age chart a little bit to Power of the Dog, and you find a young 20-something. And then when you go to Drive My Car, you find a 20-something woman who's one of the main characters there, and the change agent. And then finally you go to the oldest one, which is Jennifer Lawrence plays this grad student in Don't Look Up. So look at this picture. This picture is all these characters who are young and who are Gen Zers.
Oh my goodness. I love this. I'm so excited because I know that there's a real life transfer to this, right? And so these change agents are powerful, and I'm so curious of what that's going to look like in the real world.
Yeah, so let me walk you through real quickly how they're change agents in their movies, all right?
Let's see it.
Okay, so we start with Belfast. So Belfast, he actually, this little boy, he is, get this, he's perceiving the cost of war. So that's, we see the whole movie and the whole war through his lens.
Oh, wow.
So the youngest one is perceiving the cost of war, right?
Yeah.
Then we go to West Side Story, and in West Side Story, you have, you know, these two factions, and what's happening is that the young people, Maria and Tony, are crossing over the barriers of their different gangs, and they're doing this out of love. So the young people in this movie are crossing over barriers out of love, right? And then you go to Dune. So if you go to Dune, you see Timothy Chalamet's character, like I said before, he's stepping into leadership. I think that's so important. A young person stepping into leadership. And then he is making alliances with the native people in, you know, in the face of war. So he's the one who actually is going in and he's making alliances to build, get this, a resistance. So the young person is helping to build the resistance. All right. So that is Dune. Now, if we go to Drive My Car, you see the young person who's helping process culpability. We already talked about this.
Yeah.
Processing loss. So that is the young person doing that in Drive My Car. And then in Power of the Dog, what you see is the young person is taking out the bad guy. So that's in Power of the Dog. They're taking out.
Spoiler alert.
Sorry. Taking out the toxic bad guy. All right. And then in Don't Look Up, what you see is, we've already talked about this, but the young person specifically is identifying the threat. So she's identifying the comet that's hurling towards Earth. And she's trying to wake up everybody, wake up the apathetic to this, we're getting ready to be annihilated, right? So that's what the young person is doing there. And then the last three, so you have Licorice Pizza, which is this movie about these two this teenage boy who's 15, and he's crossing the barrier. So all three of these are crossing barriers. He's crossing the barrier of age. So he's got this person he's in love with who's 25, and so he's crossing that barrier as a young 15-year-old of age.
Yeah.
And then in Coda, she's crossing the barrier of language. So she's the only hearing person in her family, and she has to act as that bridge between the hearing world and the deaf world as far as her family is concerned. So they're all deaf and she's the only hearing one. So she's crossing the barrier of language and hearing. And then finally, King Richard is crossing the barrier of ethnicity and culture. So you have, these two giants of Serena and Venus, who we know are legends. Like we know how they were change agents. So we see them crossing the barriers of primarily a white, rich world of the tennis world, and crossing over those barriers of culture and class and ethnicity. So that is how they're all change agents. I want to go through it one more time. So here it is. You ready?
Ready.
So imagine in your head, this is what I want you to imagine, our young people today. So imagine the Gen Zers of today. Here's what I hope they do. First one is they help us perceive the cost of war, right? That's the first thing, is just helping us perceive and just be the lens of the cost of war.
Yeah.
Second one is crossing barriers, these barriers of factions, out of love, right? The next one is that they're stepping into leadership and forming alliances in order to form a resistance. And then they're helping us process our culpability and help us process our loss. They are taking out the toxic bad guy. I wish they'd do that now. They are identifying the threat and waking up the apathetic in the face of annihilation. And then they're crossing barriers of age, language, and culture, ethnicity, and class.
Yeah.
Yay, go Gen Z.
I'm ready for y'all. Bring on the youth.
Yeah.
I'm so inspired by just the few ways that you mentioned.
And when you said that, it just reminded me, I think we think this is so impossible, but in the 60s, there was such a youth movement that stopped the war, right? Like it was the youth movement that actually ended Vietnam. So,
this isn't even new. It's kind of like the youth have always had this thing.
yeah, like they usually can stop wars. So
what I'm curious about though is like, so this generation, like what makes them different from other generations?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
something about this one, I don't know if you get this, but it feels like special.
Yep.
And so I know you sat down with Grant Skeldon. He is a leading voice in this Gen Z culture. He works at Q Ideas.
Yeah,
and
that's not QAnon, by the way.
Yeah.
Just FYI, that's a
Yeah.
conference for people who are curious and leaders who are curious. And
important
like TED Talks.
clarification.
Yeah.
Awesome. So how did that interview go? Like you asked him some questions of what makes this generation different. What did he have to say?
Yeah, let's watch it.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that come to mind that are different is they are growing up in a very diverse world. I think that diversity sometimes is used as this like topic of, man, we need to become more diverse in all these different sectors, business, church. Every sphere is thinking about diversity and representation. And I think sometimes the diversity conversation can be about just the past and the pain. And I think that's a necessary conversation. But also I like to remind people to talk to Gen Z, because it's not that there's no problems there. It's just Gen Z, I think, could share from a different vantage point of like they're experiencing the beauty of diversity, the benefits of diversity, and they're growing. This has got to be the most biracial generation that's ever lived, as we're seeing diverse people come together and get married and have kids. And it just helps, I think, people that are born, even like myself, where I'm half Mexican, half South African, and I'm tapping into two different cultures and getting to see the benefits and the beauty of both those cultures. And so I think that creates a generation that has more empathy, a little bit more understanding, or just patience. I don't want to say that they're wiser. I just want to say that they're experiencing a little bit more diversity, as well as not even just that they see diversity, but also the world is a lot smaller for them.
I love that. The world is a lot smaller for them.
Yeah.
You know, and one of the things I asked him was, I feel like, you know, for me, what makes this generation different, because I have a 21-year-old and I have an 18-year-old, and I've watched them. And to me, I feel like what makes this generation different is I call them the we generation, right? And although we've been through a lot of us and them in this world, I feel like they've grown up with the DNA of we.
Got you.
So you think about, you know, how they, everything is online to them. They share everything with each other.
Yeah.
So for me, this is kind of, from a digital perspective, they've always kind of been a we together and seen the world, like he said, smaller. So I asked Grant about this whole concept of a we generation, and this is what he started. He starts it out with a different kind of way of looking at it, and then he brings it to how they can be a we.
Young people aren't cause-oriented. They are community cause-oriented. And what I mean by that is I get a lot of, especially nonprofits or churches that are like, hey, why, if young people are so passionate to join a cause, which they are, then why is it so hard to get them to volunteer? Why is it so hard to get them to serve? And I have to say, it's not that they just want a cause. They have a propensity towards a cause, but they also want to join this like community that has a cause at the core of it, at the center of it. And so that's why I think, when I even use those examples of like the ice bucket challenge, I think that's a perfect one, because that was like overnight. I even remember I didn't even know what ALS was. And I think a lot of young people didn't, but because there was this community around that cause, it's like, I don't, bigger than the problem of the fear of commitment that a lot of young people of all generations always have. Like, it's this, you kind of, I don't want to commit until I know there's not something better. Like a lot of young people, it's maybe sometimes there's a fear of commitment, but I would say bigger than the fear of commitment for young people is the fear of missing out, or they call it FOMO. And I think that the FOMO was there with that community, with the cause, because it's like, oh, I want to go and do that. I don't want to miss out. Everyone else is doing it. I want to jump in. And I guess why that's important, especially to this concept of we, it's like, I'm getting left out, and I don't want to just continue this by myself, or I wasn't doing it by myself. But when everyone jumps in and there is something good and moral and virtuous, and even I would even add, especially, and I get to kind of almost feel like and get to be a hero, there is a desire for that. It's why maybe the Avengers is one of the biggest movies for the next generation. Like, I want to be a hero, and I want to be a team of heroes.
Speaking my language.
Speaking your language, he had you at Avengers. And so I love it. You have this generation that grew up in diverse spaces. Literally the whole world can fit into the palm of their hand with technology. They're community causal. And then I love the analogy of them wanting to be superheroes and wanting to like work together like the Avengers. But we know through film, superheroes all have like, they have a kryptonite. They have something that is their weakness. And so I think Grant had a really interesting point of just an area to look out for, or what could be a potential weakness. Let's see what he has to say.
A generation that has maybe more of a, not American dream, but I want to change the world, and I more of a little bit more of a global perspective and empathy. But lastly, I would also say it's probably one of the most, or probably one of the least discipled, least mentored generations also. So you got a lot of passion without a lot of always wisdom or mentorship or guidance. It can sometimes be like a loose cannon, where you see a generation that's dying to be a part of something bigger than themselves. There's great things with a generation that wants to change the world. There's hard things when you have a generation coming from probably some of the most divorced and broken homes, and a generation that just surrounds themselves mostly with young people. They don't have a lot of deep core regular relationships with older people, and so sometimes it can feel, I say like Lord of the Flies, where you got a lot of young people that are asking advice on dating or whatever it may be from each other, and that can kind of turn into the blind lead the blind, even if it's passionately. And so there's definitely some strengths, but there's also, I believe, some weaknesses as well.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a millennial. I'm a millennial, and you're Gen X.
Hey, be careful.
You're Gen Xer.
Yes.
You're a Gen Xer, and maybe there's some boomers watching, or the full spectrum. I'm so curious what we can do to like foster this next community and to like speak life to them.
And I totally asked him that, because that was my thing too. Is like, I want to make whatever we do tonight actionable. Like, what do we do, and how can we as older generation kind of help this Gen Z be these change agents that you see in these films? And so this is what he said about how we can do that. So pay attention to this part specifically.
I think it can be as simple as these 4 letters of I see in you. Specifically just, hey, I see this in you. And I have found that might be one of the most powerful things and easiest things. It's free, that we can do, especially if we want healthy, faithful, strong, resilient, mature young people, and especially our own children, is instead of joining what the culture can sometimes do generation after generation after generation, is just criticize them. Like, you can find magazines for every generation that says this is the me generation, or this is like, there are Time magazine that talked about boomers, calling them the me generation, front cover. But what I would say, instead of jumping on the bandwagon of criticizing, you could either criticize them, or you could I would say coddle them, which has also happened a lot, where we're just, instead of criticizing, I'm coddling them. I'm allowing you to live with me as long as you want. You don't have to finish college. You can take your time. And instead, in the middle, there's something I would call coaching instead. Don't criticize them. Don't coddle them. Coach them. And there's a difference in the way the coach and a player works together, in that a coach is in the game with you. The coach loses when you lose. The coach really does care, but he cannot and will not step into the game for you. He cannot do the work for you. It will challenge you, but that doesn't mean he's criticizing you, because he's not in the stands just throwing rocks. He's in the game with you. And there's just a difference of a coach mentality towards the next generation, where it's like, I'm calling you higher because I know who you are. I know what's in you. I know what you can see. I see things in you maybe you don't see in yourself. And have a practice of regularly saying, I see in you.
I see in you. That's good, right?
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the coaching thing, like, I think that's really cool too. So the last thing I did with Grant is I asked him, I said, of all the things I said about each movie, how each character was a change agent, right?
Right. Yeah.
Which one resonated with him the most? And he said the Don't Look Up one. So he thought,
I could totally see that.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he thinks that it's identifying the threat, waking up the apathetic in the face of annihilation. Right?
Yes, they're the call out generation.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is what he said about that topic, and he's going to use by the way, he's going to use an analogy from the Bible of Saul, David, and Goliath. And if you're not brushed up on your Bible at all, David and Goliath, you might know, which is David's this young guy. So he's the young guy in the story. Goliath is this enemy who's, this toxic bad guy, right? And then Saul is the king who's allowing David to step into being that change agent. And so this is the dynamic he's going to describe.
Often I say to, especially business leaders and pastors, is I'll say, we're not losing the next generation because we're asking them to do too much. We're losing them because we're asking them to do far too little. Wow. And the world is asking them to do so much. The world is like, come on, let's go change the world. Let's go do this. And the church today in America, at least, it's like, do you want to hand out pamphlets, or do you want to like sway people to where to go on the parking team on 1 hour, 2 hours once a week? It's just like, oh man, I'd rather, if this is the call to action, I got something in me. I want to go and change the world. And so we're losing them often because we give them so little. But the reason why is we don't want to give them anything so big that if they mess it up, which young people just will sometimes, because they're learning and they're falling forward and they're maturing and they're growing, and that's just what happens as you're doing that. If they mess things up, it will really make an impact in the church or in the nonprofit or in the business. And so when I look at Saul, I was kind of like surprised when I was like, man, I don't know if I could even done this. And I'm an advocate for the next generation, but you get this young guy, David, who has this type of confidence, who's saying, hey, will you let me fight Goliath? You talk about waking up the apathetic, kind of like today. It's like, I think we think of Goliath just showed up and then David happened to be there that day. No, he's there for 40-ish days, and he's taunting them. And it's just this constant taunting of there's tension, there's struggle. They're probably after a couple of weeks, days even, you got a military that's like a little apathetic. Like, what are we going to do? We're just like living in this tension of there's just is tension. We kind of are in that in a lot of ways today, where it's just like, man, there's constant tension, especially when it comes to the pandemic of like, when are we going to go back to normal is a lot of the phrasing. We just have learned how somewhat to just live in this tension and almost apathetic to, there just is this looming cloud of problem, whether it's especially the pandemic or terrorism, because there's constant news stories around that, or now Ukraine. It's just like we're learning how to almost live in the tension where you can almost become apathetic, where it's like, I can't keep up with the next shooting or the next pray for this city or pray for this country. And I guess when I go back to David is Saul allows him to fight, and the stakes were huge. The stakes were massive. It's like, if you lose, we have to serve this nation. And I really like that. And I respect even Saul for seeing David and this young person who's like, you are not the profile of a warrior. And this is so key to today, in my opinion. And Saul didn't make him do it the old way. He didn't say, David, you got to wear this armor. This is the way we do it. This is the way we've always done it. And I think we're in a time right now where that's really important, that we have a generation that's like, they're identifying this threat, Goliath, in David's case, and they're waking up the apathetic. These, after defeating Goliath, it's a whole new world. They're singing songs. They're doing all this. They're celebrating. It's an opposite response to what has been the last 40 days for them. And I just think, man, if Saul would have made David do it the old way and the way we've always done it, if David went hand-to-hand combat in armor with Goliath, I think there's a good chance he could have lost.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
so good. I love it. And you think he used stones, right? Knocked
Right.
them out with some stones, not the armor and sword, right?
That's
So-
powerful, giving them their own way to kind of fight these battles.
Right.
So I know we've gone through all these themes and we've seen all these interesting connections, but you end your presentation with this idea of this overarching question, this dramatic question, if you will.
So let's look at the dramatic question for this year. So if we look at the dramatic question, I believe that's going on this year. I actually stole from West Side Story. You know the song, "There's a Place for Us."
Yes,
So,
my favorite.
my question is there a place for us, meaning us in quotes? Like, is there a place for we, or will we be a we? Because a lot of these movies are just asking that question again. Will we come together and be a we? And so the answer I see to that, like what these movies are all saying that I hope we can live into this year, is this. So in order to be a we have to stop marking our territory. We've got to stop doing that. And we got to motivate/parent the next generation to lead as change agents in crossing through territorial lines and barriers. And then, that minor theme, process our culpability towards what has happened, including the cost of sweeping underneath the rug, inaction or apathy, and take ownership, of the whole story. So that is what I think we can do what I believe is the story that is going to be written this year and that we can walk into.
Yeah, I love that. I think this entire conversation has been really interesting and really practical, but I want to just bring it down to earth just one more level. For everyone who's watching and you're looking for ways to jump in, how do you incorporate all of this information into how you live out this next year? And as a person of faith, how do you let the insight that you get inform how you live now?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the things I would just do is I just put these up as antennas. When the pandemic happened and the whole theme was we need to test our devotion to see if we would be our brothers and sisters keeper. The whole year, that antenna was up and I was seeing, how can I play into the story, into that theme? In the same way here, how can we play into this theme of helping Gen Z step up as change agents and all the things we talked about tonight? So to me, it's having these antennas up and then being able to play into the story. And then as a person of faith, I truly believe, and I know this is going to sound crazy, this is the crazy part.
I'm ready.
That God is a God of metaphor and imagery and parable. I think that's his language.
Oh, yeah.
And so therefore, I love the fact that he uses these people who don't even know that when their films come together, that they say these things, and that he's foreshadowing our story for two reasons. One is for empathy, like we saw with the people in Ukraine.
Right.
But then the second one is so that we know how to play part in his story, right?
Yeah,
so that we can have our antennas up and go, how can I be a part of something that you're making happen in the world, right?
Right.
So that to me is, the takeaway.
Well, I definitely am going to walk with my antennas up and just looking for the youth. If you're a Gen Z, you're in my path now. And just that powerful phrase, I see in you. And I love that. I love the things that we've learned. Yeah. I could probably talk about this all night, but I think we have...
I think the Oscars are going on right now.
I think we have the Oscars to watch. All this pre-talk.
Yeah, so we'll see you next year with this theme. And by the way, all the interviews that we did are there in the description of the video. So the entire interview. So you got kind of cuts of each one. So you can click on each interview and watch the entire interview, which there's great content, as well as the individual pages of the speakers. So go check that out. And of course, this is recorded. So share this, this live stream with folks so that we can get the word out, not about, real or this, but just this message, right? These themes, so that people can begin to be a part of this story. So.
Yeah. Guys, we've loved having you. We'd love to have you join in with these themes and incorporate them in your own way. Let us know how you're doing that.
Yeah.
And we'll see you on the other side of the Oscars.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.